her name on the ledger beside a debt she never owed. A Lakota chief tore the page from the book. The ledger was green. That is what I remember first. Not the name written in it, not the man who held it out to me, but the color of the cover, the kind of green you see on old copper left too long in rain. It had a brass clasp on the side, and the clasp had turned that same color. The man's hand was pink and soft where it gripped the spine, and he held it like a priest holds scripture, like it settled things. His name was Aldous Greer. He ran the sutler's operation at the edge of the valley, which is to say he sold flour and credit and told men what they owed him, and the telling was always larger than the lending. This I knew. Every man in the valley knew it. The traders, the farmers who'd broken ground on the flats, the freighters who wintered over, they all knew Aldous Greer's ledger had a way of growing in the night. But knowing and doing something about it are two different animals, and most men had decided they were too tired to chase that second one. I was not most men. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I have been called other things: Chief, Old Man, the one the soldiers couldn't move, once by a newspaper in Rapid City, a stubborn relic of a fading people. I did not read that paper twice. I am 61 years old as I sit here and tell you this, and I have been leading the remnant of my band on this valley land since I was 37, since the agreement was signed and the land was parceled, and we were told this small piece was ours, which mostly meant nobody had figured out a use for it yet. I am telling you about the ledger because of what was written in it, and I am telling you what was written in it because of a woman named Wikapi, which means star in our language, because she was born on a clear night in late October, and her mother said the stars seemed closer than usual that evening, seemed to lean in. I did not know Wikapi when all of this began. I want you to understand that. I did not know her. She was not kin to me, not a member of my band. She came from a different people, a different place. And she came to this valley the way many came, driven by something that had already happened before she arrived. The first time I saw her, she was standing in the yard outside Greer's store. This was in early spring, when the snow was still patchy on the north-facing slopes, and the mud in the yard was the particular thick mud that pulls at your boots and doesn't apologize for it. She was standing very still in that mud, not waiting, not uncertain, just still, the way a person goes still when they are measuring what is in front of them and deciding how much of themselves to spend on it. I was riding through. I had no business at Greer's store that day. My business there was rarely business I chose, more often business he created, but I slowed my horse because something in the way she stood caught at me. She was wearing a blanket coat, dark wool, and her hair was loose, and the wind was working at it, and she paid it no attention. In her hands was a piece of paper. She was reading it or had just finished reading it, and whatever it said had not surprised her, but it had settled into her like something heavy settling into that mud. I didn't speak to her that day. I rode on, but I thought about her that night, which is not something I say lightly. I am not a man who thinks about strangers at night. By that age, a man's nighttime thinking is mostly taken up by the things he regrets, and the things he hasn't finished, and the ache in his left knee that arrived when he was 53 and never left. But I thought about her standing in that mud, and the way she held that paper, and something in me said, there is a wrong thing happening here. I will tell you what I found out over the following days, because it is important that you understand the shape of it before I tell you what I did. Wikapi had come to the valley in November of the previous year, so some 5 months before I saw her. She had come with her uncle, an older man named Sunka Wakin, who had relatives in the region and believed, I think, that there was still land here that could be settled honestly. The uncle had gone into Greer's store on their second day in the valley to buy provisions, flour, salt, a small amount of tobacco, some nails. He'd had cash money, which should have been the end of it. But Greer had talked him into a credit arrangement. I heard this from 2 different people later, and both told it the same way, telling him cash was scarce in the valley and credit was sound, and he'd be doing Sunka Wakin a favor by extending it, and if he paid on a schedule, it would build a standing for him and make future dealings easier. Sunka Wacken had agreed. He was not a foolish man, only unfamiliar with the particular way Greer's arrangements worked. The uncle died in February. It was a hard winter. I lost 2 elders myself that season, and Sunka Wacken had been sick since December, a cough that moved into his chest and wouldn't leave. He died on a Thursday, I was told. A quiet death in the night. And on the following Monday, Aldous Greer had appeared at the camp where Wickoppy was staying with 2 of her uncle's friends, and he had opened the green ledger, and he had shown her the uncle's debt, which had grown considerably from the original purchase. And he had shown her, and here is the part that matters, her own name, written in the column beside the uncle's name, listed as a cosigner on the account. She had never signed anything. She told him so. He showed her the signature. She told him it was not her hand. He told her that didn't matter much, that she'd been present when the arrangement was made, that the Valley Law, which was Greer's interpretation of the Valley Law, held her responsible as the surviving family member, and that the debt was now hers. The debt, by his reckoning, was $47. In 1889, $47 was not a small number. It was about what a working cowhand earned in 2 months. For a woman alone in a strange valley with no family left, no land, no standing, no one who owed her anything, it was a sum that could be used to own her. And Greer knew that. The debt was the point. He'd offered her a solution, naturally. She could work it off. He had needs at the store, cleaning, mending, cooking for the men who used the back rooms. She could have the debt cleared in a year, perhaps less if she was diligent. She had told him no. That was the first no. He had come back twice more with variations on the offer. Each time the debt had grown, he'd added interest, he said, and a fee for the trouble of coming to collect. By the time I saw her in the yard that March morning, the debt was $53. She was still saying no. That was the thing that stopped me on my horse that morning. Not distress. Refusal. She was standing in that mud holding the paper and saying no with her whole body, and I recognized that posture from the inside, because I had stood in it myself more times than I could count, in front of men who held papers, and believed that papers were the same as truth. I talked to Greer 3 days after I saw her. I had spent those 3 days asking questions and listening, which is how I have always done things. I am not a man who rides into the fire before he knows where the wind is blowing. I rode into Greer's store on a Tuesday morning when it was quiet, which was deliberate, because I did not want witnesses to this conversation, not because I was uncertain about what I would say, because I wanted him to hear it without the performance of standing up for himself in front of his customers. The store smelled the way Greer's store always smelled, tobacco and pickling brine, and something underneath that I can only describe as calculation. Greer was behind the counter doing figures in a smaller ledger, not the green one. He looked up when I came in, and he nodded the way he nodded at men he regarded as nuisances he had decided to tolerate. I told him I knew about the woman's debt. He told me it wasn't my affair. I told him her name was on a paper she hadn't signed. He said the law wasn't my affair either. I set both hands flat on the counter, and I looked at him for a moment without speaking. This is something I have learned over 61 years. There are times when silence does more work than words, and this was one of them. He held my eyes for about 4 seconds, and then he looked down at his figures. I said, I am telling you once plainly that I will be watching this. I said, if that debt is not cleared, I will be in front of the territorial magistrate in Chadron before the month is out with a man who reads Lakota and English and can read her signature, or the absence of it, in your book. He said magistrates were busy men and rarely made time for Indian complaints. I said I had made time for longer rides for less cause, and I picked up my hands and walked out. That night I thought about whether I had done the right thing. Not whether it was right, clearly, simply, without argument. I thought about whether it was wise. There is a difference, and at 61 I was not yet so settled in myself that I failed to feel it. The valley had a way of arranging itself against men who made trouble for Greer. The freighter who'd challenged a delivery charge 2 years prior had found himself suddenly unable to get a line of credit at any store in a 40-mile radius. A farmer named Deckert had taken Greer to a local hearing over a land boundary dispute and won, and the following spring his seed order had arrived 3 weeks late, which cost him most of his early crop. These were the tools of a man like Greer, not violence, inconvenience made expensive, patience made punishing. I thought about this, and I decided it didn't change what I had said or what I would do. I was 61 years old, and I had survived things that made Aldous Greer's bookkeeping look like weather. I went asleep. I should tell you something about the valley before I go further, because it matters to understanding what came next. The Niobrara Valley, or this part of it, the southwestern curl where the land goes from flat to rolling and the creek cuts down between the limestone shelves, was not a place anyone had planned to share. It had ended up that way through the particular logic of treaties and land assignments, and the slow movement of settlers, which means it had ended up that way through argument and concession, and the grinding down of things that should have held firm. And what was left was a valley where 7 or 8 different kinds of people lived in proximity, without any of them having chosen each other. The Lakota band I led, 31 people when I counted carefully, more in summer when the young men came back from wherever they'd gone looking for work, occupied the western third of the valley, on land that had been formally assigned though not formally respected. The farmers held the bottom land along the creek. Greer's store and the small cluster of buildings around it sat at the eastern end, which had become a kind of de facto center simply because Greer had made himself necessary. Living close to people you have not chosen teaches you things that easier living does not. It teaches you to read the difference between a man who dislikes you and a man who fears you, because the second one is more dangerous. It teaches you which fights are worth starting and which ones start themselves whether you step in or not. It teaches you that there are moments when standing still is a choice as deliberate as any action, and there are moments when staying still becomes a different thing entirely, becomes complicity, becomes the ground the wrong thing grows on. I had been making this calculation my whole adult life. I was tired of it in the way a man gets tired of a sound that never stops, not frantic, just ground down, the edges of his patience worn smooth. But tired is different from finished. I want to be clear about that. I went to see Wickopi the week after I talked to Greer. I knew where she was staying, a camp on the eastern edge of my land, which she and her uncle had made in November and which I had allowed to remain after his death, partly because it was winter and partly because something in me said to wait and see, which is also a thing I have learned to trust. My land, technically, began at a sandstone ridge and ran west to a dry creek bed. Their camp was 200 yards east of that ridge, which put it on unclaimed ground, which is to say ground that nobody had gotten around to claiming yet, which is usually how Greer operated. He preferred to claim things after they had become useful rather than before, when the argument was cleaner. I rode to the camp in the middle of the afternoon. There was a fire going and the remains of a meal. She was working at something with her hands. I couldn't see what from a distance, and she did not look up when I rode in, which told me she had heard me coming and decided to let me arrive on my own schedule. I tied my horse. I stood by the fire. I said my name and told her I led the band to the west. She looked up then. She had dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, the kind of eyes that look at you and mean it, not performing it. She was younger than me by a good 20 years, I thought, maybe 35. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't come from smiling. She said she knew who I was. She said her uncle had spoken of me. I asked what he had said. She said he had called me a man worth respecting, and that this was not nothing, coming from him, because he was not generous with that word. I sat down across the fire from her. I told her what I had said to Greer. Not to impress her with it, I told it flat, without ornament, because she had a right to know that someone had spoken about her situation, and she had a right to know exactly what had been said and not more. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. A horse somewhere in the trees shook its head. She said, "You know he won't let it go because you talked to him." I said, "I know." She said, "Men like him don't let things go. They just change what they're holding." I said, "Also true." She looked at the fire. She said, "Why did you do it then?" I said, "Because your name was in a book it had no right to be in." She looked at me then with something I couldn't quite read, not gratitude, not quite. Something more level than that. Assessment, maybe. The way you look at a horse you're considering, checking the feet, the chest, the quality of the eye. She said, "I'm not going to stop saying no to him." I said, "I know that too. That's part of why I came." We talked for another hour that afternoon. I learned she was from a band near the White River, north and east of the valley. I learned she had come down with her uncle because there was nothing left to the north. The land there had been parceled 3 ways from Sunday, and what remained for their people was not enough to live on with dignity. I learned she had worked as a healer's apprentice in her younger years, that she knew plants and their uses, that she had once set a broken arm with nothing but straight wood and rawhide and a man's will to stay still, and that the man had full use of the arm afterward, which she said with no pride, just as a fact. I learned she had been married once briefly to a young man who had died of fever 3 years prior. She did not talk about this at length. She said it the way you say the name of a town you've passed through, not like it didn't matter, but like the mattering was a private thing and not part of this particular conversation. When I rode back that evening, the sun was already down behind the western ridge and the air had that specific cold edge it gets in March, not winter cold, but the cold that comes in behind the light when the light goes, reminder that the season isn't finished with you yet. I rode slowly. My horse knew the way. I thought about Greer and about what he would do next, because men like him always do something next, and it is better to be thinking about it before the thing happens than after. He moved in 10 days. Not against me, not directly, against her. What he did was go to a man named Clifton Harp, who held a loose kind of authority in the valley as a combination cattleman, sometime deputy for the county sheriff 40 miles away, and man who people called when they needed something done that they didn't want to do themselves. Harp was not a bad man, exactly. He was the kind of man who had decided the simplest thing was usually to do what whoever had the most money asked him to do, which made him not bad but not good either, which is a kind of moral position that I have found to be more common and more dangerous than actual evil, because it has no fixed shape. It becomes whatever the money requires. Greer sent Harp to Wickapi's camp with a formal notice. The notice said that the camp was on unclaimed land that Greer had filed a homestead claim on the previous October. Whether this was true I could not immediately verify, though I had my doubts, and that she had 30 days to vacate or face removal. Harp delivered this notice on a Wednesday morning. I knew about it by Wednesday afternoon, because one of the young men in my band had been at the eastern ridge gathering firewood and had seen Harp ride in and ride out. I went to see her that same afternoon. She showed me the notice. She was calm, not the kind of calm that is suppression, where you can see the effort, but the kind that is genuinely just calm, which I had begun to understand was her particular character. She was not made easily afraid. I respected that without making a ceremony of it. I read the notice twice. It was official looking. The county clerk's seal, the date, the language that bureaucratic papers use, which is designed to make you feel as though the authority behind it is larger and more settled than it may actually be. I said, "Do you want to stay?" She said, "I don't want to be run off a second time." That was what she said. I don't want to be run off a second time. It landed plainly, without theater, and it was exactly the weight of a thing that had already happened to her, and that she was not willing to let happen again. I said, then we'll have to make that impossible for him. I spent the next 2 days doing 3 things. First, I sent one of my band's younger men, a sharp-minded young man named Lakota who had spent 2 winters in Chadron and could read English better than most white men I knew, to the county record office to check the date and nature of Greer's homestead filing. This took 4 days round trip. Second, I went to see 3 of the valley farmers who I knew had had their own dealings with Greer's ledger, men who owed him money or had owed him money, men who might have a stake in the question of whether his records were accurate. I rode to their places one at a time and sat with each one for a while and talked about the weather and the season and the price of grain, which is how you talk to farmers before you talk about what you actually came to talk about. And eventually, the actual subject arrived on its own, and I listened to what they said. 2 of the 3 were afraid of Greer in the way I had expected. The third, a Bohemian man named Vanek, who had a reddish beard and the hands of a man who had been doing physical work since before he could read. Vanek was not afraid. He was tired in the same way I was tired. He said Greer had added $17 to his account in the past year for what Greer called storage and handling fees, that Vanek had never agreed to and couldn't account for. He said he'd been waiting for someone to make the first move. I told him I was not asking him to do anything reckless. He said he knew a reckless man by sight, and I wasn't one. Third, I moved the boundary of my band's land. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not claim ground I didn't have claim to. What I did was walk the eastern edge of our assigned land and drive new stakes at the actual surveyed boundary, which the original stakes had through weather and time, and the particular entropy of markers that nobody tends, drifted considerably inward from. The surveyed boundary, as established in the 1877 agreement, came to within 40 yards of Wickapi's camp. The current stakes, which had been placed years after the agreement by men who were not careful, sat 160 yards west of where they should have been. I drove the new stakes myself. I used good cedar posts, cut fresh from the ridge, and I sank them 2 feet deep in the cold ground, which took a full day's work because the ground was still half frozen. My nephew Mato helped me. We didn't talk much while we worked. The work was clear and it was good and it didn't require talk. The new stakes put Wickapi's camp within the corrected boundary of our land, which meant Greer's homestead claim, if it existed, and if it was legitimate, could not reach her. That night Mato asked me why I was doing all this for a woman I barely knew. I thought about it for a while. The fire was low, and outside the tent the wind was moving through the pines on the north slope with that sound it makes, the sound that's a little like breathing and a little like something else. I said, because she is alone here and she doesn't deserve to be run off, and because Greer has been doing what Greer does for long enough that the valley has started to believe it's natural, and it isn't natural. I said, and because if I watch him do this and say nothing, I have become the same as the men who do nothing, and I have spent my whole life refusing to be that man. Mato said, that's a lot of reasons. I said, yes. He said, which one is the real one? I didn't answer that. Not because I didn't know, but because some things are better carried quietly until they become clear on their own. Lakota came back from Chadron on a Sunday with news. The homestead filing was real. Greer had filed it, but the date was wrong. He had filed it in January, not October as the notice claimed. More importantly, the parcel he had filed on was different from the parcel where Wickapi's camp sat. They overlapped by less than a quarter, and that quarter was on the east side, well away from the camp. Lakota had gotten this from the county recorder's clerk, who was a meticulous man apparently, the kind of meticulous that gets offended by errors, and who had noted the discrepancy himself when Greer's filing came in, but had not felt empowered to challenge it. When Lakota asked to see the filing documents, the clerk had shown him everything without reluctance. perhaps more than he had strictly needed to, which I took as a sign that the clerk had a grievance of his own. I held this information for 2 days. I am slow this way. I have always been slow. Not slow in the sense of unintelligent. I do not say this out of vanity, just accuracy, because I have needed accuracy all my life. But slow in the sense that I let things settle before I move on them. A decision made in the first heat of information is often a decision that covers only what you can see, and there is always something you cannot yet see. I wait until I can see most of it. On the second day, I went to see Wickopi again. She had reorganized her camp since I'd last visited. The fire was in a better position, sheltered from the wind by a linta she'd added to the north side of her main shelter. She had cleared the brush from a patch of ground to the south and turned it up with a stick, beginning a kitchen garden, I understood, which meant she was thinking in terms of the season ahead, which meant she was not planning to leave. I told her what Lakota had found. She listened. When I finished, she said, "What does this mean for the notice?" I said, "It means the notice is based on a false claim. His filed parcel doesn't cover this ground, and even if it did, my restaked boundary covers it first." She was quiet. She looked at the ground she'd been turning. She said, "He won't accept that." I said, "No." She said, "So what happens next?" I said, "I go to see him. And this time, I bring the information." She looked up at me, that level look. She said, "That will make him angry." I said, "I expect so." She said, "And then what?" I said, "And then we see what he does when he's angry and outnumbered and wrong, which is when you learn the true size of a man." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, there was something restrained in it, like a smile that had been taught caution, but it was there. She said, "I want to come with you." I said, "No." She said, "It's my debt, my name in his book." I said, "I know that. And there will be a time when you stand in front of him and say your piece, and it will matter that you've said it. But this first meeting, the one where I take the information to him, that one should be me alone." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because men like Greer have a hierarchy of who they will hear, not because it's right, because it's true. He will hear me in a way he won't hear you, not because you're less than me, but because I'm something he needs to calculate the cost of. You, to him, are just a problem he thought he'd solved. I need to be the problem he hasn't solved yet." She was quiet for a long moment. The turned earth at her feet was dark brown against the still pale grass around it. She said, "I don't like it." I said, "Neither do I, but I'll use what I have." She gave a short breath that was not quite agreement but was the acknowledgement of a practical truth. She said, "When you're done with him, I want to be the one who tells him what I think of his book." I said, "That I will make sure of." I went to see Greer on a Thursday afternoon. Not alone, I brought Lakota, because I wanted someone who could read quickly and confirm numbers out loud without hesitation, and I brought Vanek, the Bohemian farmer, because I wanted Greer to see that this was not a thing he could contain to one side of the valley. I did not tell Greer I was coming. I wanted him at the store, not prepared at some other location. We rode in at 3 in the afternoon, when the spring light was still good, and the store would be between customers. He saw us through the window. By the time we came through the door, he was standing behind the counter with his arms crossed, a posture that wanted to read as commanding and read, instead, as a man who had decided to be a wall before he knew what he was walling against. I set Lakota's notes on the counter. I set beside them the copy of the original survey documents from the 1877 agreement, which I had kept in a cedar box under my sleeping platform for 12 years because I had known, the day they were given to me, that I would need them eventually. I told Greer the filing date on his homestead claim was January, not October as his notice stated. He said, "That's an administrative error." I said, "It is. The error is yours." I told him the parcel he'd filed on was 80 yards east of where Wickopi's camp sat. He said, "Close enough." Lakota said, quietly, without looking up from the notes, "Not legally, it isn't." Greer looked at Lakota the way men like Greer look at young men they have decided to dismiss on sight. He didn't say anything. Lakota held the look without any particular expression. I unfolded the survey document. I showed him the boundary line. I showed him, on the same document, where the original stakes had been placed and where the corrected stakes now stood based on the survey measurements. I told him the corrected eastern boundary of my assigned land put Wickupi's camp inside it. He looked at the document for a moment. He said, "That land was marked different." I said, "It was marked wrong. I marked it right." He said, "I'll dispute that." I said, "You can try." The surveyor who drew that line is still alive in Chadron. Lakota knows his name and where he lives. The county recorder has the original filing numbers. You are welcome to dispute it. Vanek had been standing to my left, which put Greer between Vanek and me visually, which I had arranged on purpose. Now Vanek set his own piece of paper on the counter, his account record, showing the storage and handling fees Greer had added. Vanek said, in his accent that made every word deliberate, "I also would like to talk about what's in my account." Greer looked at him. He looked at me. He looked at Lakota. He looked at the door, possibly calculating who might come through it, which told me he was thinking about this in terms of spectacle, in terms of what it would look like if it went further. I had been in enough rooms like this to know. This was the moment. The thing had balanced itself on its edge and was waiting to see which way it fell. I said, "The woman's debt is a false entry. Her name was put in your book without her consent, and the debt itself was manufactured from a transaction she wasn't party to. I want you to cross it out." He said, "I don't cross things out." I said, "Then remove the page." He said, "I am not going to do that." I waited. Vanek was still. Lakota was still. The store had that thick afternoon quiet where the dust hangs in the light and everything waits. I said, "Here is what will happen if you don't. I will ride to Chadron in the next 7 days. Lakota will come with me, and he will file a formal complaint with the territorial magistrate regarding a fraudulent debt entry in your business ledger, and a homestead filing with a false date. Vanek will file a separate complaint regarding fabricated account charges. I will find the 2 other men I spoke to in this valley who have had similar trouble with your book, and I will ask them whether their exhaustion outweighs their interest in a formal accounting. And I will bring to that magistrate a Lakota woman who will stand in front of him and show him that her name is in a book she never signed, and she will say so clearly in English, which she speaks, and which you appear to have assumed she didn't." He was quiet. I said, "Or you remove the page. And Vanek's account is corrected to what he actually owes, and you stay away from her camp." He looked at me for a long time. The light through the window was losing its afternoon angle. A fly worked the top of a flour barrel. He reached under the counter. He brought up the green ledger. He set it on the counter and opened it to the account pages, and he turned forward until he found the page with Sunka Wacken's account, and beside it Wickupi's name, which he had written in black ink in a careful clerk's hand, precise and deliberate, the way a man writes something when he wants it to look official. He said, "I don't cross things out." He reached to the side of the counter for a pair of scissors, the kind you'd use to cut string or cloth, heavy-bladed, the kind that every store kept close at hand. He cut the page out. Not tore, cut. Slowly along the binding edge, with that particular sound paper makes when scissors take it, a clean sound, final. He removed the page and he set it on the counter in front of me. I picked it up. I folded it once and put it in my coat pocket. He said quietly without looking at me, "This doesn't mean I'm finished." I said, "I know. It means you're smart enough to choose your ground." I picked up the survey document. Lakota collected his notes. Vanek left his account record on the counter, a deliberate choice, I thought, or maybe not deliberate but right either way. We walked out. The ride back was quiet for the first mile. The evening was coming on cold, clouds stacking on the western horizon, and the first geese of the season were moving north overhead in ragged formations that hadn't quite found their shape yet. Vanek rode beside me. He said, "He'll try something else." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you think it'll be?" I said, "I don't know yet. Something slower. Something that doesn't look like what it is." Vanek was quiet. Then he said, "When it happens, you tell me." I said I would. Lakota had ridden slightly ahead. He was quiet in the way young people are quiet when they are adjusting to something they've just seen, integrating it. He was 23 years old, and I thought he would carry the sight of that page being cut out for a long time. Not as triumph, exactly. As information about what was possible when you held your ground long enough for the other man to calculate the cost of continuing. I thought about the page in my pocket all the way back to camp. I went to Wikapi's camp the following morning, before the dew was fully off the grass. She was up, fire going, a tin cup in her hands, watching the smoke. She looked at me when I rode in with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for news and had decided to wait with composure. I took the folded page from my coat pocket. I held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. She looked at her name in Greer's careful ink, the name he had written to own her, beside the debt he had created to hold her, and she looked at it for a long moment. The paper was slightly ragged at the left edge, where the scissors had taken it from the book. She folded it again along the same crease and held it in her hands. She said, "He cut it out." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did he give you trouble over it?" I said, "Less than I expected. He's practical." She looked at the folded paper. She said, "I would like to burn this." I said, "Then burn it." She knelt by the fire and held the paper over the flame and let it go at the corner. It caught fast, dry paper in dry air, and she held it until it was fully going, and then she set it on the edge of the fire ring, and we watched it until it was done, and the smoke of it had gone up and the ash was just ash. She stood up. She looked at me. She said, "Tell me what I owe you for this." I said, "Nothing." She said, "I don't accept that. You spent a week on this. You drove stakes in frozen ground. You brought a man to stand beside you who didn't have to come." I said it was right to do. She said, "That doesn't settle the account in my mind." I said, "Then settle it however you need to. But you don't owe me for standing in front of something wrong." She looked at me for a moment. The fire between us had settled back to coals, and the morning was bright and cold, that particular March brightness that still got winter's edge in it. She said, "I'd like to stay, on this side of the ridge." I said, "The boundary is what it is. The camp is inside it." She said, "I know where the boundary is. I mean, I'd like to stay and be useful here. I know plants. I know what grows in this valley and when and what it's good for. Your people have elders who are sick in winter. That's not a trade. That's just, I would like to have a use here." I said, "You'd be welcome." We stood there for a moment. The morning birds were working the brush along the creek line, small busy sounds. Somewhere higher up the slope, a woodpecker was going at a dead pine. The smoke from Wikapi's fire had thinned to almost nothing. She said, "I want to go see him. You said I'd have my chance." I said, "I know." She said, "Not for the debt. The debt is ash, for him to know I'm not afraid of him." I said, "We'll go tomorrow." We went the next morning, the two of us. I did not bring Lakota or Vanek. This was a different kind of visit, and it needed to be that. We rode into Greer's yard at mid-morning when the light was direct, and neither of us was casting much shadow. Greer was outside, overseeing a delivery. A wagon of goods come up from the east, a driver and a helper unloading sacks. He saw us ride in, and he stilled the way men still when they have to recalculate quickly. Wikapi got down from her horse without hurry. She walked across the yard to where Greer stood, and she stopped 6 feet from him, which is close enough to speak normally and far enough to be a choice. She looked at him. She said, I came to tell you that I know my own name and what it's worth, and I know what you put it in that book to do. She said, and I want you to know that I know, so there is no confusion between us about what happened here. Greer looked at her. He looked at me behind her. He looked at the delivery driver and his helper, who had both stopped what they were doing. He said nothing. She said, that's all I came to say. She turned and walked back to her horse and mounted, and she settled into the saddle with the ease of a woman who had been riding since before she could walk, and she looked out at the valley with no particular expression, waiting for me. I looked at Greer for a moment. He was looking at the ground. I turned my horse, and we rode back down the valley. We didn't talk for a while. The morning was warming, and the geese were moving again, and the long grass on the valley floor was showing its first pale green under the winter pale. After a mile, she said, that was what I needed. I said, I know. She said, thank you for understanding that. I said, what he did to you deserved to be named to his face. That was yours to do, not mine. She rode beside me, easy pace, the horses walking. She said, you are not what I expected when I came to this valley. I said, what did you expect? She said, I don't know. Men in this valley have been, I don't know, tired. Most of them are tired, and the tiredness makes them into a shape that is easier to manage than they'd like. I said, I am also tired. She said, I know, but you are not the same kind of tired. I thought about that. The valley opened ahead of us, wider here where the creek bent south, the limestone shelves catching the morning light. It was a beautiful valley if you had the habit of seeing it, which long acquaintance can either sharpen or dull depending on the man. I said, my wife died 8 years ago. I tell you this because you told me something true about yourself, and that feels like the honest exchange. She was quiet. I said, she was the one who knew how to make a place feel finished. A camp, a house, whatever we had. I have been living in unfinished places since she died, not from grief, from just not knowing how to finish a thing without someone who knew how. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, my husband knew how to laugh. I don't mean he was a funny man, he wasn't particularly funny, but he knew how to find the right moment for it. Since he died, I have found that I have forgotten when things are supposed to be funny and when they aren't. I said, yes, that sounds right. We rode for a while. My horse was in no hurry and neither was I. She said, do you think he'll try something else, Greer? I said, probably, but he'll think about it for a while first, and while he's thinking about it, the season will change and the information will get around the valley. Men like him depend on people not knowing what they're actually doing. Once they know, the math changes. She said, what if it doesn't stop him? I said, then we deal with what he does, but I won't be watching from a distance. She looked at me, that level look, direct without aggression. She said, why not? I said, because you are in this valley, and this valley is where I live, and I have been watching from distances for long enough that I am finished with it. She didn't say anything to that, but something in her settled, some held thing, like a door that has been braced against wind that finally finds its latch. The spring was a good one after that. I do not mean nothing went wrong. Things went wrong. Greer found smaller ways to be difficult for some months, denying credit to Vanek for a season, briefly refusing to receive grain shipments addressed to my band. Each time I made the ride to Chadron look more likely, and each time he recalculated. He was not a stupid man. He was a man whose instrument was other people's helplessness, and once the helplessness was in question, the instrument had no grip. Wikapi settled on the land east of the ridge. She built a proper shelter, not large, a single room with a small loft, good work, solid framing, and I had 3 men from my band help her with the heavier pieces without making a ceremony of the helping. She planted the kitchen garden she'd started, and it did well. She knew the soil, she said, could read it, knew what it wanted. She gathered along the creek and on the south slope of the ridge, and she began to be known in the valley for knowing what she knew, which meant the farmers' wives started coming to her with questions, and she answered them without condescension, which was the right way to do it. She came to my camp twice that spring to work with my older people. I had 2 women in their 70s who had winter coughs that wouldn't clear, and Wickupi spent 2 long afternoons with each of them, making tea from dried plants she'd collected, working at the congestion with steam and careful hands. She moved through the work without ceremony, without the performance of competence that some healers affect, as if they need you to see them being skilled. She simply did what she knew and paid attention to whether it was working, and adjusted if it wasn't. I watched her with the second woman. I was sitting outside the tent, close enough to see through the open flap, and there was something in the way she worked that was a particular kind of calm, not detachment, but focus so complete it quieted everything around it. One of the women, whose name was Tassila, and who was my mother's last living friend, and who had the particular gift of being blunt about everything, told me afterward that the healer woman was good, and I should not let her wander off. This was Tassila's way of saying something she considered important. I said, "She goes where she chooses." Tassila said, "Then make it so she chooses to stay." I did not answer her, but I thought about it. I was 61 years old, and I had been alone for 8 years, and I had gotten accustomed to the weight of that in the same way you get accustomed to a saddle sore. You stop registering it as pain and start registering it as just how riding feels. Thinking about its absence was a different thing. There is a particular loneliness that settles into a man not from lack of people around him, but from lack of the right kind of witness. Someone who sees who you actually are and not only what you do or what you're worth or what you represent. I had been the chief of this band for 24 years, and I had been the landmark and the argument and the example and the problem, depending on who was looking. And underneath all of that, I was just a man who woke in the morning and carried the day and lay down at night. And the loneliness was in the gap between those two things, and I had stopped expecting it to close. In late May, when the valley was full and green, and the creek was running clear from the snowmelt, and the days had stretched out long and warm, I asked Wickupi to ride with me to the high ground on the western end of the valley. It is the highest point you can reach on a horse, a limestone shelf that looks out over the whole of it, the creek bend, the farms, the cluster of buildings around Greer's store, the long plains running south and east. I had gone there alone many times. I had taken my wife there once, years before she died, and she had said it was the first time she had understood why I wanted to stay here instead of going north with the others. We rode up in the late afternoon and arrived at the shelf as the light was going golden. The valley below was in that particular angle of evening light that makes everything look like it might mean more than it does. Wickupi sat on her horse beside me and looked out at it. She didn't say anything for a while. I said, "I came up here the week after I saw you standing in Greer's yard, to think about it." She looked at me. I said, "I knew you were going to be trouble for me." She said, "Trouble?" I said, "The kind that changes how you see things. I knew it before I talked to you." She was quiet. I said, "I have not said out loud what I am about to say to anyone. I am saying it because I am 61, and I have earned the right to say what I mean without circling it." She waited. I said, "I would like you to stay in this valley for reasons that have nothing to do with the boundary, or the ledger, or Greer's machinations. I would like you to stay because I find that I think better when I know you are somewhere in this valley, and that the valley has a different quality when I know you're in it. And I have been alone for a long time, and I know what I'm describing, and I know what it's worth." The last light was going pink on the limestone. Down in the valley, a lamp came on in one of the farm houses. She said, "I am not a soft woman." I said, "I know." She said, "I will not be managed." I said, "I would not know how to manage you if I tried, and I have no interest in trying." She said, You are 61 years old and I am 37. I said, yes. She said, that doesn't bother you. I said, I have learned to be bothered by things that matter and let go of things that don't. She looked out at the valley for a moment. The pink light was fading to that particular color between pink and gray that has no clean name. She said, I told myself when my husband died that I was done with hoping for something like that again. That once was enough and I was grateful for once. I said, that sounds like what grief tells you when it has too much authority. She was quiet. I said, I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to know that it's what I think, so there's no confusion between us about what I mean. The same courtesy you gave Greer. She turned and looked at me at that, and for the first time I saw something unguarded in her face. Not the assessment, not the composure, but something behind them, something that had been sitting quietly in back of all that steadiness, patient. She said, you are a difficult man to argue with. I said, I've been told. She looked at me for another moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on my arm just above the elbow, through the coat, a firm, brief hold, the way you hold a thing you are not ready to let go of. She held it for 3 or 4 breaths, and then she took her hand back and looked out at the valley. She said, I am not going anywhere. That was all she said. The valley below us had gone to its evening colors, blue in the shadows, gold where the last light caught the creek. A killdeer was calling somewhere on the flat ground below, that sharp repeating cry, and the night birds were starting up in the cottonwoods, and my horse shifted his weight under me with that patient animal sigh that means he is comfortable and in no hurry. And I sat beside this woman on the high ground of a valley I had held for 24 years, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, not relief, but something more specific than either of those. The feeling of a thing being exactly what it should be, like a stake driven true in solid ground. By July she had moved her camp inside the boundary line, properly inside, into a clearing I had not used that had good southern exposure and a year-round spring. She built more permanently there, a second room, a shed for the horse, a root cellar dug deep enough to hold the summer harvest through winter. Tessila visited her twice that summer and came back both times without saying much, which meant she approved, because Tessila's disapproval was never quiet. I rode over in the evenings sometimes. Sometimes she came to my camp. We did not make a performance of it, which was right. Neither of us was at an age for performance, and this valley had eyes enough without adding to their interest. In September, the first chill came back to the mornings, and Greer made one final move, which was to file a formal complaint with the county sheriff, claiming that my restaked boundary was fraudulent. The sheriff sent a deputy, not Harp this time, a different man, younger, more careful, who rode out and spent a full day comparing the survey documents against the stake positions, and came away with the conclusion that the stakes were correct, and the complaint was without basis, and filed accordingly. I heard this from Lakota, who heard it from the deputy himself, who had apparently been offended by the waste of his time and said so. After that, Greer seemed to decide the valley had gotten too complicated for him. He didn't leave immediately. Men like him don't leave quickly. They thin gradually, like they're hoping the situation will change before they have to fully acknowledge defeat. But by the following spring, he had sold the store and gone east, somewhere. I never learned exactly where, and another man took over the business and ran it as a straightforward store without ledger games, and the valley breathed somewhat differently after that. I am telling you all of this from a considerable distance now. The events I have described took place when I was 61. I am 68 as I sit and tell it, which means 7 years have passed, and in 7 years a great many things settle into what they actually are rather than what they seemed at the time. What settled is this. Wikapi is here. She has been here for 7 years, and this valley is a different place than it was before she came, not because she fixed it, but because a place is different when the right people are in it, when the right combination of people decide that this particular ground is worth standing on and staying on and building something honest on. I am not a sentimental man. I want to be clear about that because I think some of what I've told you might have read as soft, and I don't experience it as soft. I experience it as what is true. She is a strong and particular woman with opinions I don't always share and a way of making decisions about certain things. The garden, the arrangement of her tools, which disputes are worth engaging with and which aren't, that I have learned to recognize as her judgment being right and mine being different, which is not the same thing. She is not soft, and she does not ask me to be soft, and neither of us mistakes kindness for weakness, which is important. I have known men who confused those things, and it made them either hard or broken, and neither is right. She saved 2 lives in this valley in the years since that spring. Once pulling a farmer's boy out of the creek who had gone in during the spring flood, and once managing a birthing that had gone wrong in ways I won't describe in detail, but that would have killed both the mother and the child without someone who knew what she knew. After the second time, even the farmers' wives who had been uncertain about her were not uncertain anymore, and the valley's relationship to our piece of it shifted, not to acceptance exactly, but to a kind of practical acknowledgement that we were part of the thing, that the fabric of the place included us, and that this was reasonable and should have been assumed from the beginning. The green ledger, or what's left of it, the body of it from which the page was cut, I don't know what became of it. I didn't think about it much after that day. The page I carried out of Greer's store and gave to Wickoppy and watched burn is ash somewhere in the ground beneath her fire ring, which is where it belongs. I think sometimes about the name she had been given, Wickoppy, Star, because the stars leaned in the night she was born. I am not a man much given to what I will call the decorative interpretation of things, the habit of making events into symbols, because symbols are satisfying. But I will say this. There is a kind of woman whose steadiness, when you are close to it, does what she said those stars did to her mother. It makes things feel closer than they usually are, like the distance between where you are and what matters has shortened by some mechanism you can't quite account for. I was 61 when I drove those stakes into the frozen ground. I will be 69 in the fall. My left knee still aches, and I have added a right shoulder to the inventory of complaints. The ridge to the north of our land catches the first snow and holds it longer than it should, and the winters here are genuine winters, not apologies for winter, and I am a man who is at 68 beginning to feel the winters in a way he did not at 50. None of this seems like complaint when I am listing it. It is just the valley and the season and the body's honest account of itself. And in the morning when I ride east along the ridge and come down to the clearing where the spring runs cold, and the smoke is already going from her chimney. Her camp and mine have been one camp for 4 years now. We do not pretend otherwise. And I see the lamplight in the window, yellow against the gray morning, I think. This is what it looks like when a thing is what it should be. A man who has a good woman beside him, who chose freely to be beside him, and work that his hands know, and ground under him that is his in the way that matters, not the legal way, though that too, but in the way where the land knows you and you know it and the two of you have reached an understanding. I drove a stake in frozen ground, and she burned her name out of a dishonest book, and somewhere in between those two things, we built a life that fits the valley like the survey fits the ridge, not perfect, not without argument, but true. That is all I have to tell you. I have told it as plainly as I know how.